The Ashes of Westram. Chapter 1. A Face Like the Hall. Maisie Thorne grew up on the far edge of Westram village, in a cottage with a slanting garden and a goat that would chew the ribbons off a girl if she stood too close. Her mother, Faith, was deft with a needle and steady with a spade. She eased births, bound sprains, and spoke of Westram Hall as little as possible. If the great house was the village's beating heart, it seldom beat for the likes of them. Maisie belonged to the estate as surely as the wind did. She ran every field and hedgerow, memorised the names of grooms and dairymaids, and could tell which hayrick old Emont had stacked by the angle of its shoulders. The hall itself drew her gaze like the sun draws a sunflower. She lingered on its west lawn to watch the bees rise like smoke over clover, then slipped home with dirt on her hem and questions smouldering behind her teeth. Villagers said the Westrams had a look, long-boned faces, high brows, and eyes like green glass. The church's fading portrait of the first Baron stared down with exactly that gaze. It was idle talk, a way to make a family into a legend. Yet Father Corbin, peering at Maisie over a spectacle's rim when she was 12, remarked that she wore her hair just as Lady Margaret had in a certain portrait, that little curl at the temple, and the humour in the eye. Maisie laughed too loudly and swept the porch until dust stung her nose. In the summer of her 17th year, a chestnut gelding broke loose at the Hatherley Horse Fair. A thin boy dove after it and slid beneath its flailing foreleg. Maisie caught a stray donkey rope, looped it around the gelding's neck, and leaned back with all her weight. Panic bucked through the animal. Then a stranger's hands gripped the bridle, bringing the gelding's head down. The boy was saved, the rope burned raw across Maisie's palms, and the stranger's eyes, bright green and steady, fixed on her face as if lightning had run through him. He introduced himself as Stephen Ryle, late of Westram Hall, a name whispered once in Faith Thorne's kitchen and never again. He washed Maisie's palms at a pump and tisked at her bravery. He studied her with a retainer's old habit of counting chairs at a table and counting, too, the faces around them. 3 days later, Maisie met him at the North Woods boundary stone. The estate lay below, the hall's windows flashing like mirrors turned to the sun. Ryle spoke without prompt, as if a gate had given way. 17 years ago, he said, 2 children were born on the Westram estate within an hour. A girl under the high roof of the hall, a boy in a cottage west of the meadow. The Earl, frantic for an heir, and sick with a clever man's terror of being the one under whom the line failed, took the boy. A London agent pressed a heavy purse into the poor mother's hand and sent that family away by night. The Countess, Ryle said, knew nothing. Those who attended her believed a lie, arranged at the command of their betters, that the girl born to her died at once. Look at the heir, Ryle told Maisie. See Westram in him if you can. George Westram, with his brown eyes and hay-barn laughter, looked like a dozen village boys and none of the stone-faced ancestors in the gallery. Maisie fled home with the world tipping under her feet. Faith listened, hands laced until the knuckles blanched. She could not unsay the truth. The agent had come that winter night. Her son had been taken. The girl left behind had squawked at the air and outraged the darkness. Faith had refused the money. She burned it in her mind and stayed for reasons a woman is not required to justify. Her mother's grave, a stubbornness born of injury, and a wicked hope that the Earl, forced to watch the wrong walk before him, might be made to reckon with God without her lifting a finger. In Westram Church, the parish register admitted to a small, telling tremor. An entry read, Margaret Ann, daughter of Faith Thorne, but the thief wavered and darkened where a clerk had come back with better information. Father Corbin shrugged. Such corrections happened. Maisie rubbed a fingertip over the ink and felt both the weight and the weakness of a line that could be altered with a steadier hand. Old Mrs. Craddock, the retired midwife, completed the dreadful circle. She had been told to say the Countess's baby had died. A coin had burned her palm for a year before she spent it on her husband's coffin. "If I had it back," she rasped, "I would pull the devil by his ear and throw him out of the room." She urged Maisie to go not to the Earl but to the Countess. "Justice, if it has any manners left," the old woman said, "knocks on the wronged woman's door first." On a day when the house wore the weather indifferently, Maisie crossed the hall's threshold. The Countess came herself into the vestibule. One look at the girl's face halted her where she stood, as if a painting had stepped from its frame. They went to a quiet room heavy with books. The Countess listened. She had been told that her daughter died. She had never held or named the child. Hearing the story laid plain, she neither wept nor raged. She only said, "I married a clever man. Cleverness is a sickness when it calls fear love." George came at an unlucky knock, all brown-eyed friendliness and a scratch across his wrist. He grinned at the stranger, then went white as the account unfolded. He had always felt, he confessed, as if he were wearing another boy's coat. He loved the stables and the fields, the plain speech of men who knew which way wind and grain wanted to go. "Find a way," he begged his father when the Earl entered. Precise, elegant, and caught for once without a speech to fit the scene. "Find a way that is not on my back." The Countess spoke for them all. Summon the retainer, the midwife, the vicar, and set the story on the table. See who bowed to it. Chapter 2. Truths set on the table. A week later, the drawing-room held a strange congregation. Stephen Ryle, with his scar and bare head, Mrs. Craddock in her best cap, Father Corbin carrying the register, Mr. Haslam the steward, stiff as a poker, the Countess still, George, pale but upright, Faith Thorne, a general entering battle, and the Earl, whose cleverness flickered and guttered before steady eyes. The story did not shift when told by many mouths. If anything, it grew heavier, settling into itself. The Earl pacing the corridor until the runner returned with word of the peasant boy's birth. The way he stilled, decision settling around him. The London agent gliding through a cottage with a purse and a lie. The midwife instructed to repeat, "The child is dead," until it hardened into a wall no one could climb. Father Corbin raised a trembling hand over the register. Mrs. Craddock wept into linen. Faith sat upright, face carved out of endurance. The Earl said 3 words, like a hewn thing dropped to a floor. "I did it." He had done it, he claimed, in fear that the line would end and that it would end on his watch, which is the way a clever man measures sin. He did not ask whether the line deserved to end, only whether it could be made to live by sleight of hand. He had chosen the beautiful wrong. "What will you do?" the Countess asked, calm cutting through the air like a seam-ripper through bad stitches. He saw the world's knives, gossip, petitions, laughter, which wounds more than either, the Chronicle's columns, his mother's contempt. If he spoke, he would break more than a name. If he kept silent, the theft continued. "Then do not announce," the Countess said. "Begin." 2 simple words became a plan. They would not push George from his life, nor thrust Maisie into rooms like a curiosity. They would start by fitting the house to the girl it had denied, and by building a place within the estate that the boy could fill without breaking. Law, like a boulder, could be rolled later, or a road built around it. So they began. Each morning, Maisie climbed the hill to sit with Mrs. Malvern, the housekeeper, and learned what she had lived beside without knowing, the timing of clocks and the ordering of fires, the economy of soap, the whispering vengeance of moths. She served at dinner and learned to catch a look across a long table and know whether to call for more soup or a diversion. In return, Mrs. Malvern visited the cottage and learned from Faith how to mend a sleeve without unpicking the whole garment. Exchange made them both less suspicious of the other woman's kingdom. Maisie went to the steward with straightforward insolence. When he murmured that her presence at the ledgers was unusual, she replied that his discomfort was the very sign her presence was required. He began, grudgingly, to deliver the books, then, sheepish, to respect her sums. Once he blurted that she had her father's head for figures, then flushed and apologized. She accepted the compliment and left the apology to hang. The Countess walked her through the portrait gallery and named the people in gilt frames, who had been cruel, who foolish, who had eloped to Bath, who had opened the hall's doors during a famine and lived long enough to be called extravagant. She did not ask Maisie to be any of them. She introduced them like relatives you cannot escape and must therefore learn to accommodate. Maisie found George in the stables with sleeves rolled and tallow across his jaw. He beamed whenever she came near and seemed taller because he knew what he could be used for. He asked once, in a corner, "Do you hate me?" And she asked in return, "Do you hate me?" They grinned at the absurdity of it and found a brother and sister's peace. The Earl worked. Men like him, when ashamed, turn penance into order. He put his fear of humiliation to the plough and pulled with it. He asked Maisie to walk the home fields and to read beside him, and then asked what was wrong with his proposals. "If we choose that path," she would say, dry as stone, "must we invent another lie to hold it up?" He would wince and choose differently. Cleverness began to be used in the service of truth instead of in the concealment of it. News seeped as water does into every seam. Old Eamont's eyes went wet when he tugged his cap at Maisie. Mrs. Pell, who sold ribbons, dabbed at the curl near the girl's temple with proprietary pride. Some men smirked in the public house and told jokes about lineages and latrines. Most of those burned out quickly, as small fires do when they have no good fuel. A letter arrived from Sussex, cramped hand, fierce spine. The woman who had borne George wrote that when a lord said the world would break if she would not yield, that was not consent. Her son had eaten well, yes, and she counted that a blessing, but she still woke with a blanket at her face and smelled someone else's story. Faith sent coin. The woman sent it back. "This is clean," she wrote. "Keep your money to wash yours." They continued the uneasy exchange. Letters like tightrope, a lock of hair wrapped in paper, a line acknowledging that two women had been made to share a cradle neither chose. The Chronicle printed a sly piece, Provincial Peculiarities at Westram Hall, and traded in ellipses and coy initials. The Earl read it, fed it to the fire, and said more to the flames than to the room, "I have burned more important things." No one contradicted him. Chapter 3. Households and Names. On a bright autumn day when beech leaves lay like coins on the path, the Countess gathered household and tenants in the great hall. She did not mount a stair or make a speech from a height. She stood where sound carried and said the simplest thing. 17 years ago she had borne a daughter and had been told she died. The girl had not died. She stood here now. She took Maisie's hand and laid it on her arm. A murmur moved through the room, surprise, relief, and the kind of practical calculation all villages keep at hand. The Earl stepped forward and did the one thing no one had imagined he would. He bowed to Maisie, not as to a guest, nor as part of a performance, but as a man who means to bend. "I have wronged her," he said. "Hold me to account." Silence answered, jury and judgment both. He did not ask for forgiveness. He accepted weight. Life under the new truth went on, which is the only way any truth proves itself. George took the home farm and made it sing. He could read the weather like a sailor and the soil like a ledger. He sat at Harvest's Head with dirt under his nails, and the tenants nodded because he was one of their own who had learned to speak two dialects, field and figure. In winter, when the books came in from the outlying farms, he carried them to Maisie. They did sums at the long table, solved for survival, and laughed, careless as children, when everything balanced. Maisie learned rooms. She learned how to ask a shy woman to sing and make it feel like grace, how to place two lonely people side by side and let them discover one another without interference, how to listen through half-sentences and pick up their dropped threads. She also continued to go down to the cottage for bowls of soup and the plain speech of the woman who had called her to supper by the name she would never surrender. Faith watched her carefully, sometimes reaching out to touch a curl and drawing her hand back, embarrassed at her own impulse. The Earl, gimleted by regret and newly attentive, went more and more into the village. He stood in doorways without a purse and asked what had been needed that had not come. He learned the names on small stones by the churchyard wall, as if praying backward through a rosary of failures. He ceased saying Westram in every sentence, as if the proper noun itself were both noun and verb enough to absolve a man. He fell ill in a late spring, burned through by the bright fuel of a nature that had tried to power a household with fear, disguised as necessity. In June, he died with the window open, listening for hay-cutting. He said, "I am sorry," without flourish, which was the best he could do. The Countess and Maisie stood afterward in the portrait gallery. Lady Margaret the Fearless stared from one end with a pruning scratch painted faintly on her wrist, a woman who had once paused among roses to bleed and had not minded. "Do you hate it?" the Countess asked, meaning the gallery, the house, maybe the whole tradition. "I hate what was done with it," Maisie replied. "But it's no sin to have ancestors. It's a sin to use them as a weapon." The county settled around the altered tale like an old dog changing rooms. There were a few who insisted titles and truths were the same. There were more who knew how to tell them apart. The law, ponderous, slow, did not immediately right the early theft, nor did it throw down what had been built since. Instead, it made space for an arrangement that served the living. George as master of land and labour, Maisie as mistress beside the Countess, learning what would be required if ever a paper must be signed or a decree sought. Faith as honoured guest, whose quiet dignity checked any mouth inclined to be clever. Names, always the sharpest tools in the drawer, began to be used with care. Maisie Thorne belonged to the cottage and to the woman who had taught her to shell peas and keep her hands clean. Margaret Anne came hesitantly to the Countess's lips when she stood by the girl's bed and thought her asleep. Miss sufficed for those testing the water. You there, from old Amont, still meant, move, you're about to be kicked. Each name opened a different door. She would not give up any of them. Letters kept going to Sussex, spare and pointed. The woman who had borne George wrote without sentiment and without surrender. Faith replied in the same key. Between them, a rope stretched taut and held. Chapter 4. Beginning. Years passed. The river kept scribbling stones. The bar of ash leaves carved above the hall's gate stopped looking like a shield against falling and started looking to Maisie's eye like a reminder. Leaves feed their tree when they fall. She found that her love for the estate did not require a lie to thrive. It required a ledger, yes, and good harvest, and a home farm that paid. But more than that, it required a house that could hold two truths without burning one for light. The Chronicle discovered fresher scandals. The county's jokes grew stale and then died. People took their cues from harvest and birth and the behaviours of those under the high roof and those under the low. When truth makes bread, it becomes harder to sneer at. On a day of early frost, the hall hosted a christening for a tenant family. The Countess insisted the reception be held where the chairs were good and the fires hotter. George came up from the home farm, sleeves decently buttoned, wife at his arm, a Hatherley girl with a laugh like a bell's easy swing. He moved among farmers and carters confidently, switching tongues without effort. Maisie watched him place a calloused hand on the shoulder of a nervous lad and saw a household made safer because a boy had been allowed to be what he was. Later, she walked to the boundary stone where Stephen Ryle had once tipped her world. Lichen had colonised it. It looked like nothing, the way important things always do. She put her palm to the cold and thought of the old man's first startlement and the long ache of a truth carried too far alone. Ryle still lived in the lodge at the north gate, hair cropped close, scar bright as a stitch. He would doff his cap when she passed and call, "Miss," and she would say, "Ryle," and between them would run gratitude and the rue of years. Maisie sometimes visited the parish register and stood with Father Corbin, who had grown tetchier and kinder at once. He knew, with a priest's bone-deep devotion to order, that if she asked for the name to be lined out and rewritten, he would do it only on a fresh page, label it "supplement," and keep the old ink visible. "Historic," he would say sternly, and then bring tea. She never asked. She preferred the record of what a lie looks like once it has been seen and left standing, no longer a wall, but a warning. On a warm afternoon, the Countess and Maisie sat in the yew garden, where hedges make rooms for those who cannot bear the wide sky. Bees stitched sound through the air. "Sometimes," the Countess said, "I still hear you as a baby, the small, outraged sound of a creature new to air." She reached across and squeezed the young woman's hand. "Mostly I am simply glad to hear you as you are." "Mother," Maisie said. The word broke and remade a part of her every time. If there was grief remaining, and there was, the world never takes grief away, only gives it context. It did not poison. It fertilized. Faith Thorne kept her cottage doors open, and her counsel rarer than before, for she had learned the hard way what stories are not hers to tell. When she walked through the hall, women lifted their eyes from their work, and men made room where a woman like her had never stood. She touched the curl at Maisie's temple now and again without apology. At harvest's end one year, after the wagons had come in and the measuring had been done, George brought the books to the long table and they went through them by candlelight. The numbers balanced. He tipped back his chair and grinned the old boyish grin. "We have disappointed ruin again," he said. "We have begun," Maisie answered. "Still beginning," he added, with a look down the passage where portraits slept in the dusk. "Good," she said. "Beginnings root deeper than proclamations." On certain mornings, a memory rose sharp and clean. A dusty fair, a thin boy's shriek, a rope's bite, a stranger's hands closing on a bridle, a retainer's eyes startled wide, as if a dead woman had walked up to say good morning. All of it led to this: a house made larger by truth, a farm that sang because the right man ran it, a mother at peace enough to eat without scanning the door, a countess who had never been wronged without sinning and had kept her balance for 17 years. A name, or rather several names, used not as doors slammed in faces, but as keys to rooms shared. The hall endured, less as a citadel and more as a place designed to shelter different kinds of weather. The ash leaves above the gate read, to anyone who cared to notice, as both emblem and instruction: "Leaves fall and feed. So do lies when they are burned." The ashes of Westram, Faith's phrase for the purse she refused, for the sorrow she had allowed to light her way without scorching it, went into the soil and made certain roots stronger. If names have power, so too does the simple speech of confession, "I did this," and the equal speech of identity, "I am this." Maisie Thorne, Margaret Ann, could stand on either side of the hall's threshold and choose. She could sign a guest registry without flinching and take a bucket up backstairs without thinking it beneath her. She could pour tea at a long table and rise from it to mend a sleeve. She could be addressed as Miss Thorne in the morning and Margaret at night, and each name could be true. On the last evening of harvest, the family, those earned by blood and those made by truth, stood on the terrace as swallows spun dark thread through a gold sky. The hall behind them glowed with the sort of light that does not need lying to keep it. George spoke softly to his wife. The Countess slid her arm through Faith's. The two women looked down at the home farm, where lanterns bobbed like grounded stars. Maisie rested her palm on the stone balustrade, cool and familiar. She had loved the house at a distance once, then hated what had been done with it, and now, finally, loved what could be made within it. "Begin again tomorrow," she said. "As always," the Countess answered. They did. The end. If you've enjoyed this story of love, redemption, and quiet courage, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll be the first to hear our next Regency romance on the Regency Gazette channel. Thank you for listening.